Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we have the pleasure of being joined by the amazing Raven Reads on tonight's paranormal stories. We certainly have a feast for the ears tonight. Don't forget to go over to her channel and check it out when you're done here. The link will be at the end of the video on screen, as well as in the description for you to click on at your leisure. Raven produces some truly brilliant content, and it is not to be missed. But without further ado, it is time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was 6 or 7 years old, when my older brother and sister left state to go stay with our dad, I was too young to join them, so I had to stay in the room my sister and I shared, alone, which creeped me out a bit, as it was a big old farmhouse with a rusty green roof, and that room always seemed darker than the others. In the middle of the night, I woke up to something tapping on my sister's bed on the other side of the room. I rolled over and saw a white figure with black eyes sitting on the bed, tapping it, like smacking it with its hands, saying, "I know you're awake." I was in shock mode when it stood up, tilted its head before walking over and saying it again. "I know you're awake," like it knew I was looking. I hid under my blankets and closed my eyes as tightly as I could, still hearing the same sentence uttered over and over, until I woke up in the morning and rolled over to face my wall. This white blob orb looking thing flew across my wall and out my bedroom door. I remember thinking it was like a quick flying white possum. Heading out to the kitchen for breakfast, I remember being so proud of my encounter and that I survived it. I don't know why, but I was boasting it to my mum and stepdad. "I saw a ghost last night." I've been interested in the paranormal my whole life, and I think this is why. I know I was young, and it could have been my imagination with a mixture of being in the room by myself, but it felt so real. The tapping is just how our bed sounded too. I've also spent hours on the internet looking for some history on the old house, and I can't find a thing.
I'm from Minnesota, around the Twin Cities area, and I am most certain that the house I grew up in was haunted. To preface, I never really felt comfortable in the house, but it wasn't like an overbearing evil presence or anything, and it was a normal suburban house. It was completely finished, and there was nothing that really marked it as creepy in any sense. I would have small encounters growing up. The more general, tame experiences would be that I could never watch TV or be in the living room in general without the feeling of being watched. Our living room was connected to the kitchen, and roughly almost every 5 minutes, I'd have to look behind me due to the feeling you get if somebody is watching you or staring at you. Sometimes I'd just hope that when I turned around I would see my mom checking up on me or something while making dinner, but usually that wasn't the case. I would typically turn around to see nothing. But there were 3 scary experiences in this house that I wanted to share. And these experiences kind of cemented my belief in the paranormal, ghosts, and spirits of the sort. Number 1. It was the first day of 5th grade. I remember that clearly because of how scared this experience made me. I don't know why, but for some reason I had woken up early. It was still dark outside and my vision was still blurry from being half asleep. I saw this sort of fuzzy gray figure next to me. I didn't think much of it since I just assumed it was my eyes adjusting to the dark. At least that's how I felt until my vision slowly started to focus, and the figure slowly started to take the shape of a person laying next to me in bed. I don't know why, but I ended up just closing my eyes and thought that maybe it would go away. I ended up keeping my eyes shut and still until my dad came in and turned the light on to tell me to get ready for school. Number 2. I don't remember how old I was, but I think I was around the 6th grade since I know it happened after the first experience. When this happened, I was completely home alone, with my family having gone out to do something, perhaps shopping. It's been well over 10 years at this point, so my memories are fuzzy on the details. Before I continue, I want to say that other than the doors that led directly outside, our bathroom was the only door that had a lock. I had just finished showering when this happened and I was getting dressed. My locked bathroom door swung open violently. I don't know how, since I always make sure to lock the door, and there were no windows near or even open at the time. It scared me so badly that I ended up having to call my aunt on the phone to have her calm me down, since my parents did not have cell phones at the time. Finally, the last experience I want to share is close to when we were moving, and I really didn't have anything in my room besides my bed since we had packed up everything to move to the new house. All I remember from the night was that I had been trying to fall asleep when I heard the sound of scissors cutting, the sound of the metal scraping against the other when you open and close them. It unnerved me since there was nothing in my room except for my bed. I ended up sitting up to see that the corner of my room had a pitch black figure. It didn't really have a form of any kind, but it definitely scared me. I just ended up deciding to leave whatever it was alone and try to go to sleep. No less than a minute after I'd laid back down to try to sleep, I hear what sounded like a woman's breath exhaling sharply near my ear, like one of those exasperated sighs. I was terrified, but just told myself to go to sleep and not look at it. A lot of the experiences I had, I sometimes think could have just been my overactive imagination as a kid. But talking about my experiences with my parents, they've told me that sometimes they saw pictures falling off the wall for no reason, or things on shelves that were far from the edge falling off. No one was ever harmed, and it wasn't like it was unlivable, but talking to them definitely made me think that perhaps what I experienced was real. The thing that cements my belief that they weren't just tricks of my imagination was that once we moved to our new and current house, most of my paranoia disappeared, which I'm very thankful for.
I grew up in a really old house. It was nearing 100 years old right before I moved out, and it used to be a post office or something way back in the day. The house is creepy and big. There are 3 stories, but I was never really scared living up there or anything, although I did like to scare my friends with all kinds of made-up stories, and they always believed me too. The only weird thing that ever happened was when my parents left over a December holiday, and I had the house to myself all week. Me and my friend were bored, just sitting outside on the back porch drinking some beers. All of the doors were locked except for the one closest to us. It's just a metal frame door, fitted with glass that you can see outside of, but from the outside you only see your own reflection, like a one-way mirror. Well, while we're just chilling and talking, someone bangs on the door so hard, I was surprised that the glass didn't shatter. My first thought was that my parents came home early and caught both me and my friend drinking underage. We go into the house and there's nobody, and we looked everywhere. About 2 days go by and nothing happened. Now my room was covered in posters like most teens. I wake up in the morning, and every single one of my posters are taken off the walls and cupboards, and are lying neatly folded on my chair. There's no one in the house but me. So either I did it while sleepwalking, or it was someone else. To this day I have no idea what happened, and nothing weird ever occurred after that.
My dad and my grandfather had a huge fight and never spoke to each other after my grandpa divorced my grandma and married his woman on the side. He lived in New York and we live in Ohio, so it wasn't like anybody saw him that often. But when he would come down to town, all of my dad's brothers and sisters would go visit him, and all the grandkids would too. So of course we would go, but Dad would just drop us off in the driveway and pick us up. He never went in to see his dad. So when I was in the 8th grade, we got a phone call that something went wrong during my grandpa's open heart surgery and he wasn't going to make it through the next 24 hours. So my dad packed my brother and I in the truck and picked up my grandma. Then he drove through the night so that we could see him one last time. We got to the hospital and all the family was there, but Grandpa had been in a coma. The doctor said that he might pull through since he made it through the night. So we stayed for a day, and before we left, as we were saying goodbye to him, he woke up, just as my brother and I were saying goodbye. He couldn't talk because he was intubated, but we told him that we were there, and he seemed to look at us and understand. There were tears in his eyes as we said our goodbyes and left. He died a few hours later. At no point in time did my dad go into the room to see my grandpa. So we go back for the funeral, and I've never seen my dad cry, ever. Even after almost losing his foot, at other funerals for family members, not a single tear. Through the service, no tears. Once we got to the gravesite, he still showed no emotion. After the service was over and everybody was filing away, it was just my dad, my brother, and I. And my dad just broke down. He was bawling like a baby, leaning over the casket, just saying, "I'm so sorry, Dad. I never said goodbye. I'm a terrible son." We were there for about 15 minutes before Dad was able to go. Now for the supernatural part. We came home, and the next day, my brother asked why I was outside of his room the night before. I said that I wasn't, and no one else was either. For the next few days, every night, there was a shadowy man standing in the doorway of my brother's room. When my parents were really getting worried and questioning whether or not my brother was making this up, suddenly pictures of my grandpa in the house would wind up on the tables in completely different spots to where they once were. Some of the pictures were moved from not even in the same room to tables in the kitchen or the living room and other parts of the house. My dad even slept with my brother a few nights as all this was going on to help my brother sleep through the night because he was so scared. Through all of this, my dad was still beating himself up and crying every night. Usually, my dad never dreamed. He would just go to sleep and wake up the next morning. Then one night, my dad had a dream where he was fishing with my grandpa. This was kind of strange because my grandpa only ever did this once in his life, and that was with us. As they were fishing, they talked. My grandpa said that he understood why my dad was upset and he forgave him. He said he was sorry to my little brother for scaring him, that he just wanted to see his buddy one last time. He also said he wanted to talk to Dad just one more time. And then he stood up, hugged Dad, and walked off into the woods. After that night, there was no more Shadow Man and no more crazy stuff happening in the house.
I live in an old house that was converted into a triplex. All of the doors in my apartment push themselves open randomly, and any toiletries left on shelves in the shower are thrown to the floor. The first year or so living there, it scared me each time it happened. For example, I would be laying in my bed, and the door, which would be fully closed, would push open. Nobody else was home. I'd freak out and check everywhere for an intruder, or I would be in the living room and would hear a big commotion from the bathroom. I'd go look, and my shampoo and conditioner and body wash would be on the floor. Again, there's no one else to mess with stuff, and my boyfriend would complain to me about the same stuff happening while he was home alone. I half expected all my cupboard doors to fly open at once, and the kitchen chairs to flip upside down one day. To make matters worse, my boyfriend's son went through a night terror stage during that first year. I was chatting about it with my friend, and telling her how we tried everything to help him stop having the terrors. She told me not to think she was crazy, but wondered if there was a possibility it could be something paranormal. She didn't know about the other stuff, so her saying that gave me goosebumps. I hadn't considered it before, but putting it all together scared me. We've been living here for 5 years now. He grew out of the night terrors, and I'm pretty sure all of the weird things that happened are due to pressure and temperature changes, but for good measure, I say hello to the ghost when a door opens on its own.
I woke up alone in my house one day when I was fairly young, younger than 10. It was strange that there was no one in the house. My mom worked nights, but she wasn't in her room. My brothers usually slept until about noon. My dad, being out of the house, was really the only one that made sense, since he'd be working. Normally this wouldn't bother me too much, but something just felt off. The house was too quiet. Even turning on the TV and playing music loud just made me more aware of how silent everything was. It didn't help the day was really overcast. I eventually started feeling ill and called my mom, but no answer. Same for my dad. I called Lucas and Rory, my brothers, wondering if maybe they were at their friends, but nobody answered. After about an hour of this uneasy feeling, I heard somebody whistling from downstairs. It was very similar to what you might hear the serial killer in a horror movie whistling. I was way too freaking creeped out to investigate. I'm pretty sure I actually started crying, and this time I repeatedly dialed my parents' numbers over and over and over. The whistling stopped. There was some laughter that sounded like it was coming from a toy, and then it started up again. I was lucky in that I lived just across the street from a small strip mall with a bar, bakery, and a Shell gas station, among other stores. I also knew the neighbors well enough that I could have gone to their houses, so I decided to leave the house. As soon as I opened the door to leave, my brother came from behind me asking where I was going. This freaked me out because I was completely sure I had been in the house alone. Apparently, he thought he'd been alone too. We were supposedly watching the same TV at the same time, but that was impossible because neither saw the other. He'd heard the whistling and laughter, which brought him to leaving as well. We left the house together and decided we could go to the Shell for at least some other human contact. Apparently, Rory had the same idea because he came walking down the street too. I told them both my account of what had happened. My brother said what happened to him, and Rory told us that he heard whistling in the streets. Everything about that day seemed surreal. The person in the Shell seemed on edge. The bakers at the bakery didn't seem like their normal selves. Normally, they're really talkative and kind. These are the people that called my mom directly when I escaped the house at 3 years old and went right for where I knew the good cookies were. They barely acknowledged us. Rory even popped into the bar and said the staff there seemed really off. The three of us went for a walk, going to our school playground, and stayed there until it got dark. When we got back home, everything seemed normal again. My parents didn't question where I'd been. The weird atmosphere was gone as soon as the door closed behind me, and the silence that had overwhelmed me that day was gone as well. Since things seemed normal, I explored the basement to try to locate the sound. One of the stuffed toys that should have been on my bed was down there. The bear couldn't have been the noise source since it had no music box, but it didn't stay in my house much longer after that. The next day, my brother insisted that it was a prank to scare me. That didn't make any sense. There's no way he got an entire neighborhood to stop bustling throughout the day. My dad would not ignore 20 missed calls from me, all one after the other. The days following, my brother seemed to have forgotten it altogether. Rory told me he'd rather not talk about it, and that was that. Maybe it was just a dumb prank with a lot of weird coincidences, but still, thinking about it today absolutely makes my skin crawl, and that whistling is one of the worst melodies I have the displeasure of remembering.
The stairs in my house are so old that they creak when someone goes up them. And since everyone has a different weight and a different way of walking up the stairs, I can usually tell who it is coming up. So one night, when I'm the only person in the house who's awake, I hear the stairs creak one by one, starting at the bottom. Unfamiliar footsteps. When they reach the top, I convince myself to take a look. I check. No one there. I didn't hear anyone go down the stairs, and the hallway that connects to the top of the stairs creaks just as loudly, and the door at the bottom of the stairs is closed. There was just nothing there. Nobody used the stairs. It could be explained by the house being old, but the stairs making noise one by one in the middle of the night? That just doesn't happen.
When I was just a kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, I had an imaginary friend that I called Carlos. My family was very aware of it, as they let me go to the yard in a small hallway behind the house where I was constantly speaking to somebody else. I remember a few memories about it. I remember taking toys to that space and taking the cat so I could show my new friend. My family could always see me from the window. One day, my mother rushed out for me in a panic because I was climbing over the fence of our yard. I told her that I was going to go with Carlos because he wanted me to come with him and his family. She asked me what I was talking about, and I proceeded to describe the horse and carriage that was out front where his parents were waiting. I asked her if I could go with them. She grabbed me and we went inside the house. Another time, during a homework session in preschool, my mom and I were cutting out some newspaper articles. Suddenly, I got really excited, telling my mom that the kid from the paper looked almost exactly like Carlos. The article was about a revolutionary moment that happened 80 years ago in my town. During my childhood, I was a big fan of dinosaurs, so I had a lot of toys from Jurassic Park. Some of them made noise like roars, and some of them had alarms from the Jurassic Park facilities. I remember clearly how normal it was for me to be playing alone in my room and then have the toys start to make noise as well. When people asked me about it, I just said that Carlos was playing with me. There were occasions when I wasn't at home, where my family would walk past my room to get to the bathroom and hear the toys going off inside. The only way to get those toys to function is if you actually press a button, but nobody was in the room. After a while, my family gave those toys away. One night, I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night and I was excited because I'd lost a tooth and it was underneath my pillow. I knew that the tooth fairy was going to give me some money, so I lifted my pillow to check. There was my tooth. I just assumed the tooth fairy hadn't come yet. I just went back to my original position and was staring at the ceiling. But then I felt a weird sensation, like pressure, all around me. I started to hear voices, but no actual words. Just voices that were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. Suddenly, I started to perceive movement, like someone quickly walking around my bed, and that's when I saw it. In front of me, there was a shadow projected onto the closet. It was definitely a shadow and not a person. It was a humanoid shadow, on the wall, as if there was a person standing between my bed and the wall, but there was no person there. The only light that was visible was the moonlight entering from the big window, but it was clear enough to be sure that the shadow was there and a person was not. At first I just looked at it, full of fear. I noticed that the shadow wasn't moving, but it was vibrating. Its whole body was in a perpetual vibration, and the voices were now silent. As I was about to grab something to hide from it, the shadow started walking to the right, reaching the side wall, and it was like the shadow walked through it. It didn't disappear, it just walked through the wall like it was going to another room. After the shadow was gone, I went to my mom's room to tell her all about it. I know that I wasn't dreaming, and my mom recalls that moment with me crying her and telling her all about what happened. The curious thing was, when I returned to the room and I looked for my tooth again, it wasn't there, but there was money. Both of my parents say that they didn't do it. And that was the first time that I felt true fear in that house. One night, everybody was in my house and we were sleeping when suddenly my older brother started screaming. He was probably 16 years old at the time. The whole family rushed into his room and saw him scared. He told us that he woke up as a negative feeling was passing over his whole body. And then when he looked to the corner of the room, there was an old woman in a white dress who was looking at him with big black eyes. He asked nervously who she was and didn't get a response. Instead, without moving or walking, the lady disappeared from where she was and reappeared right next to him, standing next to the bed with the same unnatural face. That's when he screamed. After the scream, the old lady vanished just as we were entering his room. Now he has a daughter, and 2 years ago, his daughter was just 3 years old. She was wandering around the house, and we noticed that suddenly she just stayed frozen, looking in one direction. This was odd because she's a particularly active child. Out of nowhere, she says, "Dad, there's an old lady calling me from that room," and she pointed to my brother's old room. We all looked at each other, and he grabbed her and took her away, telling her that there was nobody in there. She just went quiet, and nobody talked about it after that. Going back to my youth, there were some events that the family considered normal by that time. Noises in the kitchen, doors opening and closing, footsteps, that sort of thing. Eventually we just ignored it. As I grew older, I was about 13 or 14 years old. I moved to my older brother's room, and during the night, I began to feel observed from everywhere at the same time. This room has no windows, so when the lights are off, it's complete darkness. However, I did have music posters on the walls and some pictures hanging. I started to see faces in the reflections. In the light of the movie posters, when the moonlight would come in, I would see faces, and the same thing in the glass of the pictures. I even took a photo of one of them, but that happened a long time ago. Cell phones did not have external memories back then, or at least mine didn't. So when the phone died, the content went with it. It was a selfie photo, and when I looked at the result, there was a giant face with its mouth wide open. It was displayed on a poster behind me. It was so clearly a human face. I showed the picture to everybody I could, and they were shocked. One day, I was alone in my house watching the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. There's this one scene when they're attempting to exorcise her and the family is waiting outside. There was this crucifix in the scene that was vibrating, and at the same time that this crucifix went down to be an inverse crucifix, all the doors in the house were punched hard, like a furious strike to them. Just one loud slam and every door in my house was shut. I freaked out and went to all the doors looking for an explanation, but I was entirely alone. Sometime during this same time frame, we had a cousin living in our house since she was studying in the local university and she was from another state. We also had a female black cat. This cat had come from the streets and we took her in. My cousin was alone on one occasion in the house, just watching TV, when she noticed the cat sitting next to her, gazing at her with a focused attention like the cat was concentrating. And then she said that the cat spoke to her and asked where I and my little brother were. The cat said that it wanted to play with us. My cousin was pretty shocked for what had just happened and ran out of the house. When we found her, she was crying and told us all about it. We were talking to her and told her that maybe she was just sleeping or confused. A few nights after this, she was sleeping in my old room. If you wanted to go to the bathroom, you actually had to pass through that room to get to it. So one night, she woke up just as my little brother was walking toward the bathroom. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then she saw a woman with hair so long it could touch the ground and weird clothes on, walking slowly behind him. My brother did not seem to notice that she was there. My cousin followed them with her eyes until my brother opened up the bathroom door, and then the woman disappeared. But 2 seconds later, the cat jumped up to my cousin's bed and above her chest, staring at her with that same concentration like before. My cousin freaked out and screamed, and we all rushed into her room, finding her hysterically telling us the story and pointing to the cat. The poor cat was so traumatized from all the noise it escaped the room. My cousin left the house days later and started to rent an apartment instead. At 16 years old, more or less, I moved to the bedroom in the second floor of the house. The first night, I was walking up the stairs and I heard my name, like a whisper in the hallway. It was a female voice very close to my ear. I looked everywhere, but there was nobody with me. I didn't put too much thought into it, so I just continued to my room. Some nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something was just not right, like a constant concern that wouldn't go away. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I just sat in my bed listening to somebody approaching the second floor. I heard the door of the living room open. To get to my room, you had to pass the stairs door, pass the living room, and open my room door. I heard the footsteps getting closer to the other side of my door, and it stayed in there. At that moment, I knew that there was somebody outside my door. The door began to open slowly by itself, and that's when I realized that there was nobody on the other side. I had an intense feeling of discomfort and like some kind of pressure was emanating from where a person should have been. I stayed frozen for about 5 seconds until the same footsteps started running from the door to my bed. I was so scared that I hid below my blankets. But then, nothing. When I looked outside the blankets, my door was closed. The feeling was gone too, but I know that I didn't close my eyes during that entire experience. I wasn't dreaming, and I never heard the door close. Then the scratches started. At the beginning, they weren't very significant, so I didn't worry about it. Just small cuts on my arm, shoulders. I just wanted to believe that it was me when I was sleeping. But then it started to get serious. I woke up several days with large cuts on my arm, my abdomen, my legs, and even in some parts of my back that would have been impossible for me to reach. They were 3 to 4 inch scratches in parallel, and they hurt. I knew that it couldn't have been me because I have the bad habit of biting my nails, so I really don't have nails. And also these scratches seem to be more like an animal's, like when a cat scratches you, but larger. One day I woke up with severe pain in my shoulders, both of them. I looked, and in both shoulders I had these deep cuts with dried blood. My mind tried to be skeptical about it, but on one occasion when I was watching TV in my living room, I was wearing some loose shorts, and I started to feel a pain on my leg. Immediately I checked, and from out of nowhere, I was watching 3 scratches appear on my legs, like something was scratching me in real time. I put my hand on it, but it didn't stop. Then I saw 3 thin lines of blood appearing out of nowhere. That's when I approached my uncle. Long story short, I talked with my uncle about it, saw the scratches, and I joined his church for a little bit of time. Strange things happened in that congregation too, but that's another story for another day. One afternoon, I went to my room to pick up something, and as I was entering the living room just before my room, the TV turned on by itself. I wasn't really scared, but I was a little curious. I went to turn it off, and as I was approaching the stairs, the TV turned on again. Just static. I reached the power cable, disconnected it, and ran to the stairs. That night, I decided to move from that bedroom. I was sleeping when a loud noise woke me up. After a few seconds of trying to figure out what it was, I noticed that the closet door was shaking, like somebody was inside trying to get out. As I was sitting on my bed, the door aggressively flies open, and some kind of force pushed me down on my bed. I started praying the words my uncle had taught me, and after a few seconds, the thing was gone. I had no option but to return to my old room. Back in that room, some time passed before anything happened, but then the scratches continued. At that point, I honestly considered it normal, and I didn't really do anything about it. I had problems with my ex-girlfriend about them, saying that they were made by another woman, but obviously that wasn't the case. Anyway, we started to let this thing just happen, with no questions. Then, on one occasion, I woke up looking at the wall next to my bed. I went to the kitchen to grab some water. It was deep in the night. I recall that there was no light from the windows. When I finished my glass of water, I looked back to return to my room and froze. There were several shadows of humanoid figures standing all over the dining room and living room. They had different sizes. Some of them were taller, some of them were bigger, and they were all facing me. The shock of the scene made me almost want to faint, but instead, I woke up looking at the wall. I was so confused since the previous experience was so real, but here I was again in my bed, without any remembrance of having walked there. So, I got up out of my bed and went again to the kitchen. I was pretty happy that maybe what I had just experienced had been a nightmare. I don't know why, but I laid down on the floor, and I started hearing voices all over the place. They were familiar voices from brothers, relatives, and then I started to feel them walking on me. I couldn't say anything, and I couldn't move. It was like I was nothing to them, and they were literally walking all over me. And just as I began to cry, I woke up again, looking at the same wall. I heard someone in my room, and when I looked back, there was this old man standing in the corner of the room. I asked him what he was doing there. I didn't really feel fear, I just was curious. This strange old man started talking about the phases of a dream. Suddenly he had a board, and he started drawing some kind of circle between circles, some of them merging in space. He talked about how in some phases the consciousness travels between different dimensions, and some of them interact between them, allowing them to share elements. Time and physical manifestations could be shared too. As he was explaining this to me, I was seeing the drawings and trying to understand everything that he was telling me. But then, as you might have guessed, I woke up, staring at the same wall, but this time I couldn't move. I was looking at the wall, incapable of moving, and I began to shake as I heard the door opening behind me. And then, nothing. No footsteps, no presence for a long time, until I suddenly felt something jump onto the bed next to me, behind me. Shaking with fear, I just waited for the worst to happen. It was extra weight in the bed next to me that I knew was a person. But then I heard it, a strong purring sound like a cat. I was so relieved because I thought for sure my cat had somehow opened the door and decided to cuddle with me. I was a little calmer then, until I saw a thin, dark hand with large, pointy fingers grabbed my shoulder as the purring sound increased next to my ear. I peeked around to look at what was attached to the hand grabbing me. Something like a long black tail and some kind of crest at the end entered my view. This thing began to roll onto one of my legs. I was shaking and desperate, trying to end the paralysis. And then, again, I woke up, looking at the wall. This time, I was able to move. I got up out of bed and took my phone. I made a call to somebody, I don't recall who, but I was telling him all about these dreams and experiences, the humanoid figures in the living room, me lying on the floor for no reason, the old man with the dream chart, and the strange creature that was purring. Then this person says, "And then what? And how did you feel?" Questions like that. I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. There was something odd in the voice of the person on the other end of the line. The voice started to become deeper and deeper, and then I realized I was dreaming again. After this revelation, the whole scene changed. I wasn't talking on the phone anymore. I was in my room, but I was looking at myself in the bed, looking at the wall. I tried to move, but it was like my body wasn't there. I tried to see my hands, but I couldn't. And then I heard the door opening behind me. I started to feel a negative presence approaching me. I couldn't look back, so I began to make an attempt to communicate to myself by screaming, but no voice came out of my mouth. And then I saw it. Below me, a humanoid figure crawling on the floor. It was black and hairless and very thin, like abnormally thin. It was like a very thin man that was walking as an animal. Its chest almost touched the floor, and it had a tail as long as its body with a crest at the end. Its spine was visible because it was so thin. I noticed some kind of pointy ears, or two pointed limbs where ears should be. This thing was walking very slowly, approaching my bed. Then it looked at my bed and jumped up next to my body in the bed and began to purr. As I was watching the scene that I had just experienced from the other angle, I was desperate to try to make something happen, to make the thing go away. But I was just a spectator of my own nightmare. This thing grabbed my shoulder and came really close to my ear, purring more intently than before, and it began to roll its tail around my leg. At that moment, I started to get away from my bed. I tried to hold back and help myself, but something was pulling me out of my room. As I was leaving, I felt a terrible fear. Even if I had no physical body in that state, I could feel a negative, strong presence invading me, and I realized that this focal point of energy wasn't coming from the thing in the bed. I saw that we were not the only beings in that room. There was this man looking at this creature, looking at the bed, and looking at me. As I was passing next to him, I felt a strong negative force coming from him too. He was tall. He was entirely deep black, like a shadow, but it was visible that he had a large coat and some kind of headwear. He was just standing there. It was like he had the power over the entire situation, like he was controlling everything else. Then, in a quick move, this thing turned back to see me, not myself in the bed. He looked at me, and his red eyes made me scream internally, and I woke up, looking at the wall. But this time, everything was gone, and it was real life. I got up, went to the kitchen, and went to the garden, turned on the TV just to be sure I was awake, and after realizing it was all over, I went to sleep in the living room, just thinking, still feeling the fear. I kept thinking back to my younger days, when I would see this shadow on the wall, trembling and looking at me. The day after, I woke up with scratches on my shoulder. Some months passed, and I didn't share this experience to many people, only the ones closest to me. A friend of one of my brothers came from a different state for vacation since he wanted to visit Six Flags and we lived pretty close, so he stayed in the house for about 3 days. The day of the trip came, and so we left early since we had some hours of the trip ahead. I was driving, and since it was dark, one of my cousins started to tell paranormal experiences. After some of the stories were told, this friend, who is pretty chill, was very quiet about the subject. All of a sudden, he said that he had something he wanted to share with us. He told us that during the second night in the house, he woke up in the middle of the night, looking at the couch as he was sleeping on it. He rolled back and saw my grandmother sitting in her chair. Now, by that time, my grandmother had been in an accident and she had broken her spine. She could no longer walk, so we had got her a specialized couch. She also had advanced Alzheimer's, so she very rarely spoke. He said that she was just staring at him with this hateful stare. Her eyes were almost popping out of her head. She began to insult him, wishing death upon him, telling him how miserable he was. And then, during the insults, she got up from the chair. This is something that she physically cannot do. He told us that this action from her was very disturbing. As she was walking toward him, it was in a very disjointed, unnatural way. Her legs were bent in 45-degree angles, but not the way they should have been. Her arms were pointed at his direction, and she continued to curse him. After a few moments, he woke up, looking at the couch. He was confused and looked behind him, only to encounter a lot of my family members who were standing next to the couch, surrounding it. He recalls my father, my mother, some brothers, uncles, and my grandmother, and myself being there, with horrible expressions on their faces. Before he was able to say anything, all the people standing next to him began shouting in unison things like, "You don't belong here. You're going to die. Leave this house." And they all started punching him. He says that all he remembers is the pain. He could feel the punches all over his body until he woke up again, looking at the couch. This time, scared, he looked to his back, and my grandmother was in her chair, smiling to him, but with a very forced, disturbing smile. He described the moment as if time had suddenly stopped. No movement from anybody, no sounds. She was frozen still. And then she wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was this creepy creature sitting in the chair with the same smile. He remembers it as a large black humanoid creature with a tail coming up between its legs and red eyes looking at him. He told us that the change was instant. One moment it was my grandmother, and the next it was this thing. He stayed frozen, trying not to move, but in an instant, the creature jumped from the chair, crawled toward him, grabbed his leg, and dragged him until it reached my bedroom. The door opened and the creature tossed my friend inside the room. As the door closed behind him, he screamed in the room in the dark until he woke up, looking at the couch. But this time, he was really awake. My cousin, who was aware of my story, and me both looked at each other in complete shock. The one who was telling me the story had never heard my story. I proceeded to tell my experience, and then we decided to change the subject, and we've never spoken about it since. After these events, my experiences remained at a pretty normal level, casually hearing movement in the rooms, some sleep paralysis moments, but the major interactions were changed to another family member in the house, my grandmother. As I mentioned before, my grandmother had Alzheimer's and couldn't walk. Since I started working after finishing college and my mother was also working, our family got a pair of nurses to take care of her when we were out. Then, since she began to require more detailed help, the nurses began to sleep in the house in my grandmother's bedroom with her. They worked in 24-hour turns, so one of them was always there. One day I was watching TV when one of the nurses asked me if I had experienced anything paranormal in the house. I asked her what happened, and she told me that in several occasions during the night they woke up hearing voices in the room, and that my grandmother was speaking to them clearly. This was odd because she could hardly speak at all. They tried to figure out what the voices were saying since my grandmother was whispering to the voices, but every time they moved, the voices disappeared, and after looking at my grandmother, she always had her eyes wide open, but wasn't saying a word. During several days that I was sitting with her, it seemed that she was looking at a specific point in the room. One day I asked her what she was looking at, and she pointed to a point in the room, and then she started to follow something with her finger. Sure enough, I felt something small passing next to me at the same time she was pointing in my direction. One day, one of the nurses told me that the night before was the most intense experience she'd ever encountered in the house. She quit her job and refused to ever come back. She told me that at the beginning it started with the same voices and whispering all over the room. She tried to ignore it, but a strange negative feeling was starting to become more evident. When she looked in the direction of my grandmother's bed, she noticed that my grandmother was sitting in her bed, but in front of her there was this black creature also sitting and looking at her, face to face. This thing had its hand resting on my grandmother's chest. The nurse described it as a black humanoid creature with a very thin arm, almost skeletal. She said it was like they were talking and whispering to each other. The scene shocked the nurse, and she rushed to turn on the light. After turning it on, the creature was gone, but my grandmother was awake. The nurse asked her if she remembered anything that had just happened, but my grandmother just repeated that she was feeling pain in her chest. A red mark began to appear right before the nurse. 3 days later, the nurse quit. We hired a new pair of nurses sometime after, and they also reported voices in the room, but they weren't worried about it. They were focused on her care. One afternoon, there was a small family reunion in the house, and my grandmother was in her bedroom since it was late then. We heard a lot of noise coming from her room, and we rushed in to see what was happening, only to find my grandmother in the opposite corner of the room than her bed was. She was on the floor crying and injured. We asked her how it happened, since she can't walk. She told us that something grabbed her and pushed her out of the bed. We were worried and confused since there was no way she could have done that herself. She said that she was scared of something that she couldn't understand. She was only repeating that something bad pushed her out of the bed. It became more common that bruises would appear on her body. Her health decreased in a major way, and it required our full attention and comfort, until one day she died in her room in the morning. My mother was with her when it happened, and since that day, the house has become calmer. The feeling of being watched, the negative presences have all been gone. The scratches disappeared, and now that I only live with my mom, we think that we don't have to worry about it anymore. From time to time, I hear activity in my grandma's room. Rooms opening, furniture moving around. Even one day, I was taking a bath and I heard footsteps approaching the bathroom. I immediately recognized them as my grandmother's high heels, which she would wear before she got hurt. I didn't feel any fear, though. On the contrary, I knew that she was here to watch over us, and it makes me feel a lot better. I don't know that we're 100% free of the negative presence in the house. Maybe some of them are still here, waiting for somebody new. They appear to focus on one person at a time. The other night, not long ago, I took my new girlfriend to my house. We entered the room on the second floor, and she waited for me while I was grabbing some snacks. When I returned to the room, she was standing still, looking at a single painting on the wall. I asked her what happened, and she told me that during the time she was waiting for me, the painting started to move from left to right, each time more quickly. She didn't know what to do but to watch it. At the same time I opened the door, the painting stopped in its original position. She asked if we could leave that room for the night. I didn't see the painting move, but I've experienced so much in that house that I do believe her.
After a shower, I walked towards my room with the door half open like I left it, but was frozen in fear as I heard footsteps and the sound of paper scrunching loudly in my room. There was even a huge shadow being cast from my room's alien lamp on the hallway floor. My first thought was, what's my dad doing in my room? Then I heard his voice laughing and chatting with friends and family in the lounge/kitchen. My next thought was, I hope everyone in the house isn't in the lounge/kitchen. I silently walk into the lounge room and could see everyone in the house was there and the kitchen casually chatting. My heart skipped a beat later at night. I went back to my room and noticed everything was in its place. Nothing seemed to have been touched, and the rest of the night was normal. I was 10 at the time, but was too scared to go into my room during that occurrence. That was over a decade ago, but I know 100% what I saw and heard, and it definitely wasn't a pet. We don't have any of them, and the footstep sounds were too loud to be something like a dog. It sounded like my dad's heavy footsteps. I know it can be explained by something rationally, but it still gives me the chills whenever I think about it to this day.
So, I just moved into a 5-bedroom house with my boyfriend. The house was built in 1900. The energy in the house has always felt super off. We hear banging a lot and footsteps upstairs. We have 4 roommates, and at least one point, all of us have felt something weird in the house. We've all left the house at one point due to feeling uneasy or scared. Every room in the house has 2 access points in the closet, one to an attic and one to the inside of the wall. Because the house is so old, it has double-walled insulation, meaning that I'm literally able to stand up and walk inside the walls if I remove the little door. Each room has a little door that is poorly nailed into the closet. There is also an attic tunnel which leads from my boyfriend and I's upstairs bedroom to our roommate's bedroom. Often the sounds we hear come from places where people cannot walk. I also wake up at around 2 or 3 a.m. most mornings feeling really scared, but other than the above creepiness, nothing has actually happened that I would consider paranormal. Last week, it was really stormy, and the energy felt really off. We were having a loud conversation, talking over each other, when we heard what sounded like a basketball dribbling upstairs. It was loud enough that we all stopped talking to listen for it. Then we heard footsteps from inside the upstairs wall. The bedrooms don't go back as far as we heard the noise. The roommates had to go to work. I practice Wicca, and I was feeling very uneasy, so I decided that I would leave also and get some things to protect the house from dark energies. Now here's the part that I cannot explain. I was burning sage, walking around the house, basically saying that only positive energies were welcome here, to please not scare us and to stop bringing negative energy into the home. On the other end of the house, I had set up some crystals, jet for protection specifically. The cat was with me when this happened, but I heard what sounded like a pig squealing from the other side of the house, and a clatter. Well, I nearly crapped myself because the crystals, which were sitting on a flat surface, had all been knocked off the ledge. I figured they'd fallen behind the couch, so I moved it out of the way. They had fallen behind the couch, and sitting on top of them was a blue hydrangea flower. I have no idea how to explain this. I had just cleaned the carpets and vacuumed behind the couch that week, and my kitten plays back there all the time and rips up everything in sight. He jumps up on the counters just to rip flowers apart. Well, this flower was perfectly preserved, not missing a single petal. Even if after all this it somehow managed to get there, The hydrangea bush out front had been dead for at least a week. None of my roommates were home or knew that I would be blessing the house, so they didn't do it just to mess with me. I still feel uneasy on the other side of the house when I'm alone, but on the side where I found the flower, I feel peaceful. The only place that gives off really dark vibes is the closet with the creepy tunnel and attic access. Could it be a gift from a ghost? I do believe in ghosts, but I've never had anything like this happen before. Hey guys, Raven Reads here. Thank you so much for watching this video and listening to tonight's stories. I hope you enjoyed listening to them. I certainly enjoyed narrating my share. A big thank you to Mortis Media for inviting me back to the channel. I always enjoy working with Mort and reading stories for all of you. If you liked my narration and you'd like to hear more of it, you can follow the link in the description and subscribe to my channel. I read true scary stories, narrate classic horror novels, and original short fiction. I discuss supernatural and paranormal topics and generally post content about all things weird, supernatural, and macabre. I also share horror artwork and design from time to time. We're a low-key group of horror junkies and we're always happy to make room for some new faces. I do hope to see you over on my channel. Subscribe and you'll become an official lovely listener and a member of the Conspiracy of Ravens. We meet several times a week to take dark and twisted journeys into the night, and we'd love to have you along. Before you do, be sure to subscribe to Mortis Media if you haven't already, and toll the bell to summon spooky stories each night. It would be a shame to miss any opportunity to let the darkness take control. Thanks again to Mort for inviting me to the channel, and I hope to see you over on my channel soon. Bye for now.